Hi, I'm making a video today to talk about um, something that is very hard to put a word on, but that I feel like a lot of people recognize in our surroundings. And for lack of a better word, I'm going to call it the polycrisis. Um, I don't know, it depends on the person, but I'm sure some of the people who see this may feel like everything is a little too expensive, money is a little too tight. There's wars going on in multiple places. Depending on your own worldview, you might even say that there's genocides going on in many places. Depending on what worldview you have, climate change is really bad. Depending on what worldview you have, either Donald Trump or Joe Biden is going to ruin the country. Depending on what worldview you have, anything you want, but everything seems like kind of a giant mess, doesn't it? Let's start by saying what exactly is a polycrisis. Actually, let's not start by saying that. Let's start a little deeper because if I start with what a polycrisis is, most of the people who are watching this video will disagree with me about some aspect of it and they'll stop watching. So let's start with what a definition is, because it seems like we all disagree about the definitions of things. Definition is a word whose etymology comes from a bunch of European languages back to Latin. Okay, so the Roman Empire, and de finis, completely bounded. All of its boundaries are well defined. Pretty straightforward. Seems like a reasonable definition for definition. Let's keep moving. Okay, here you see a very classic example of borders that are completely defined, which is the world map. You see all of the countries are completely encircled by a border, apart from some areas that are disputed, and we'll get into more of that later. Let's take a look at also the United States map, and you see all the states have their borders completely encircling them, and they also, all the counties, and we can go even zoom in further. Here's an old map of Manhattan with all of the properties, or I guess those might be blocks, but there's also then properties within those blocks all marked off who owns what and who gets what. And there's even little areas allotted to nature. So Central Park or other little parks throughout the city. Let's look one more time, though, at the world map, because as you notice, it's a different orientation from that map of Manhattan that I showed you from 1873. And let's consider something interesting, which is right now it's centered on the Greenwich Meridian, which is in England. Actually, that's sort of the center of the map, but it could just as easily be somewhere else. You know, who's to say that the Atlantic Ocean doesn't need to be divided in half? Why can't the Pacific Ocean be the one that's whole? And I don't know, I think that's an interesting assumption that we sometimes don't question, but it's not too deep. A little deeper still, though, is if we consider north being up, not being a universal idea. So the map with the south pointing up was a common anti-colonialist symbol in Brazil, and I'm sure other places at different points in history, because to people who live in the south, their north is the south. You know, it gets colder as you head south, not as you head north if you live in the southern hemisphere. So it's just kind of curious to see, though, because I definitely didn't grow up seeing a map like that on my school wall. And we can also, of course, then center it off of Greenwich for the upside down map as well. But who's to say again that this is upside down and not the other? In space, there is no up, right? Up is a relative direction. The Earth has an axis pointing out of its top and its bottom, and top and bottom are just labels. If we look at, for example, India, this map of India, it shows south is up, and it's just kind of interesting to consider how India is quite near the equator. There isn't even that much distinction between north and south in terms of the angle of the sun in the sky, apart from where it rises and sets, because it's so close to the equator. in fact, there's nothing wrong with even putting east or west as up on the map if you wanted to, where the sun rises or where the sun sets. It all comes down to which way you look at it. If you're floating in space, I promise you'll spend a lot of time looking at the Earth up, from the English language perspective, upside down, because you'll be floating everywhere. So let's consider the actual Greenwich meridian. Where is Greenwich? It's in England. It's actually in London. They call it Greenwich, but it's actually in London. It's the Royal Greenwich Observatory, like a 20-minute drive away from downtown London. And the Royal Greenwich Observatory is the place that was used for map-keeping centrality by people from the seafaring world in the 19th century, which was largely the United Kingdom. Note the words United and Kingdom, as if the world falls under one umbrella, right? And these seafarers left England and went east and went west, and sometimes going south around Africa, sometimes going south around South America, but either way leaving England, and that's why the center was picked there. And it's important to note that even this Greenwich Observatory has not remained in the same place relative to the spinning Earth for as long as it's been measured. It's been shifting because the Earth's tectonic plates are moved by convective currents. And so the meridian, although it started at the Greenwich Observatory, is no longer located exactly at the same location that it was first. And in Greenwich, at the meridian, there's this little arc on the floor that shows which direction what cities are and how far away they are. And it very much centers you at that point in space on the surface of the Earth, and points to how far these other places are. And if we consider a lot of those places are on the next map that I have here for you, which is the greatest extent of the British Empire at one point in its history. And yeah, a lot of those dots, the little islands in the ocean, are also red. And this is kind of the area covered by that United Kingdom that voyaged out, right? And let's look at what happened to the rest of the world. For example, in Africa in the Berlin Conference, a bunch of Europeans got together and divided up the continent of Africa and said, you get this part, you get this part. And again, they were setting definitions. This is the French Africa, this is the British Africa, right? And it's curious to note as well that there's a couple of spots that are left free. Well, what on earth was there? And could all the African people go there? Well, no. One of them is Ethiopia, our modern day Ethiopia, and the other one, if I'm not mistaken, is Liberia. And Liberia is a place where in the past couple decades before that, the United States had offloaded a bunch of now freed people of African descent who were dumped on the coast of West Africa and told, now you're free. So that's a long story, but one worth knowing about. Let's look at the actual ethnic map of Africa, or at least one approximation of it. And here you see the borders look extremely different, and they don't look like they're too strictly defined. They're pretty amorphous. There's no straight lines, and there's just deep clustering in some of those areas, right? You have to remember that humans are a species from Africa. Africa is our homeland, right? We came from East Africa and migrated all over the world. And if you look at this Pacific-centered map of human migration out of Africa, it makes a lot of sense why you would want a Pacific-centered map for this sort of purpose. And you see that humans left Africa maybe around 65,000 years ago, according to this estimation. But humans started somewhere around 160 to 250 to 300,000 years ago. It really depends on who you look at, but at least 100,000 years before they left Africa. And when you consider this, it makes a lot more sense why there's such density of ethnic groups. There's just something called time depth is much deeper in Africa than it is anywhere else. Humans have just been there longer, and so things have developed and marinated for much longer. Now, if we look at what happened to the overlap between the Berlin Conference boundaries made by Europeans and the regional extents of the ethnic groups in Africa, you see very few of those ethnic groups don't have their traditional territory cut off by a European-defined government. And that's actually one of the major reasons why, at least in my opinion, my humble estimation, why Africa struggles so much to this day, despite being by far the richest continent in terms of natural resources of literally any kind. I mean, this is the reason why Africa has been so exploited. Its government borders don't match its people's identities and borders and the kingdoms they had in their traditional history. There's other issues as well, but that's just one of them. Here's the Americas. Here's how it got divided up. And interestingly enough, as I'm sure you can assume, here's the ethnic groups of, for example, Brazil, and you see how many of them there are. And interestingly, there's not even borders drawn around these. They're just sort of centered at some location. And there's lots of areas that are just expanses of wild nature. And if we look at North America, we see a similar sort of thing, at least on this map. This creator didn't elect to put any borders around the peoples. What you do see is some borders around some, they're called like ecological kingdoms, so sort of regions that are similar in climate and plant species, and flora and fauna and topography and things like this. These areas are ecological kingdoms, and the different peoples are in their own spots in those ecological kingdoms. So I'm from the United States, so we're going to be considering some of the things that have happened in its history. If you look at this map, it happens to be in Spanish, but it shows the 13 colonies' original extent and Native American territory, Indian territory, and Louisiana, and Canada, and New Scotland, and Florida, which is part of Spain. This is kind of how it started out, and as you can see, if there was anybody living in those 13 colonies, they were told, move, go to Indian territory, right? And but shortly thereafter, just a decade or a decade and a half later, all of those Indian territories are now, gobbled up by these states as they expand and claim more land, right? And these definitions are argued over and warred over, and little by little they're settled in this process that is taught about in schools as manifest destiny, right? And today people still talk about manifesting. When you sort of believe in something and make it happen somehow, you just magic. It's almost seems magical, but a lot of people believe in it, and it seems to work for some people. I don't know. But let's look at, for example, Europe to this day, right? They don't. We would think they don't own the whole world anymore, or they didn't divide it up anymore. But let's take a look at some islands that are overseas countries and territories of the EU, the European Union. And it's actually kind of shocking how many of them there are. Anyone born in a lot of these places is going to actually be a EU citizen, which is quite strange. But in reality, actually, in some of these places, I don't believe you are. What you do get, though, is Europeans or people with EU citizenship can travel to that place for free. So it really depends on the place. But to me, it seems more of a benefit to the EU member states' citizens than it is to the people on the island, because they existed just fine before they were colonized. They were existing with community and happiness and joy, I'm sure, and of course struggles. So it's kind of strange. And we can take a step further and consider, what's the deal with this United Kingdom, United States, United Nations? Kind of strange. European Union, right? These conglomerates are are made up of a bunch of members, and the United Nations is the current, theoretically, the protector of the current world order, right? And yet, there are constantly, in the current news as of February 2024, there's, most of the Security Council or most of the countries are voting to take some action to stop what is happening in Israel and Palestine, and the United States vetoes it because there are 5 countries with veto votes. So how much do people really get a say if they don't get a say, right? It's kind of unfair. But I think the point is the unfairness is stable, right? It does protect the world order for it to be unfair. In the United States, there are it's called the United States, right? There are 50 states, and they each have a small say in the government. Part that is just dependent on statehood and part that's dependent on population, and that creates some unfairness in itself, but that contributes to the stability. And then the government and the national government and the local governments are always at odds, but that being at odds is considered stable. And so all of it sort of is about these checks and balances that balance out the unfairness so that it's never too unfair and it lasts a long time. So how are definition disputes resolved? Well, it kind of depends on the definition, but in some ways it also doesn't. Usually from the top down. So whoever is in charge makes the rules. Whoever runs the country, sometimes the people who started the country have to make the rules. Sometimes the people who run the country make the rules. Depends on how autocratic it is. Whoever is elected to run it, if it's more democratic, but then it's still whoever's on top, right? Whoever has the most money, if it's the government's corrupt, or whichever country has the biggest guns, if it's a war. We see that going on in Eastern Europe, in Russia and Ukraine. They're trying to duke it out to see who comes out on top and who gets to say where the borders are, where the definitions are. So definitions are deeply linked to hierarchy because unless there is a hierarchy, definitions can't be enforced. And one of the most extreme cases of this in recent history has been, of course, the world wars, especially World War II, where some members of Homo sapiens were defined a different way than others. And because of that, they were put into a different spot on the hierarchy, right? And this hierarchy was also a deadly one. So whether hierarchies can exist without being deadly is a different question altogether. But certainly, it's easy to think of many hierarchies that are deadly, and the ones that aren't deadly are at least extractive, or dominating or controlling, right? Your boss works you really hard because they're trying to get their promotion, right? That's just kind of how it works in a hierarchy. And it comes down a little bit to a question of, is this human nature? Is human nature hierarchical? And to answer that, I think it's more important to center it around the universe. Is the universe hierarchical? Is nature hierarchical? These are kind of deep, abstract questions, but I can show you an example of one place where hierarchy is not so obvious. For example, a food chain seems like a pretty sensible hierarchy. There's top-level consumers and bottom-level consumers and producers and everything else. But in reality, what happens to the top-level consumers when they die? Or anything for that matter? Well, it's eaten by the mushrooms. So really, this is not a food chain at all, but a cycle of atoms being reused by one organism and then another. The atoms entering multiple lives. And it's not as deep as people think it is. You ate a piece of lettuce and some of those atoms stayed in you, and now those atoms are part of an organism. It's not so profound. So I guess other examples of definitions being enforced are like governments enforcing property disputes or illegality, legality of an action, whether it's defined as legal or not, or proving things in court, or All of these definitions require enforcement, and enforcement requires a hierarchy. And hierarchies require domination. Someone must be under someone else in a hierarchy of humans, or something must be under something else in a hierarchy in nature. Some religions definitely argue for a hierarchy, but this is not necessarily universal. So, is it universal that hierarchies, domination, and definitions be the modus operandi? Well, some people would argue that people who commit violence or things like this aren't being rational, or they're not being logical, or maybe they'll use a word like they aren't being empathetic, or they aren't being kind, right? But all of these are the assessment of one individual of another individual's mode of thought. So in some ways, these are measurements, and they're measurements based on your own values. So this comes to the idea of logic, reason, rationality, proofs. These are kind of the ways that Western civilization values in figuring out what to believe or what to do. And it's as evidence of this, I mean, you can go to the English language Wikipedia and you can click on, there's articles about this, you can click on any page, as long as it's not a stub, anything that has actually been fleshed out, and click on the first non-pronunciation link. So whenever you see it, just anything that's not pronunciation, click on it, and then on the next page, click on it, click on it, click on it, and you will see that in very few clicks, you will always end up back at philosophy, which is sort of speaks to the centrality of the idea of philosophy, of rationality in the way of thought of English language speakers. And philosophy and rationality, these are lines of thought from Rome and Greece and maybe Egypt before, depending on what you think of the Greek philosophers spending time in Egypt. But yeah, so let's look at the definition of rationality, since it's so central. The quality of being guided by or based on reason. In this regard, a person acts rationally if they have a good reason for what they do, or a belief is rational if it is based on strong evidence. Right? Evidence. Okay, so basing something on evidence. And this is what logic comes down to. Any mathematician will tell you that based on what assumptions you pick, you can derive a math system. And fleshing those out, following their implications, is how you prove anything. And if you can prove something using only the minimum assumptions that are agreed upon between you and the question asker, then you have demonstrated it to be true. And if you can't, then you don't know until you can prove it to be true or false. A different definition that I found says rationality is the quality of having reason or fact of being agreeable to reason. So this is just if you are shown a logical argument, you will hear it out and you will understand it and you will agree with it. That's sort of what this is getting at. So let's look at a little bit evidence, because evidence is basically those assumptions from which you derive what you believe to be true. All right, so evidence is appearance from which inferences may be drawn, and I want to highlight that inferences can't be drawn without evidence, right? You need proof, evidence to create a proof, or you need assumptions to create a proof. You need something to work with, right? So all of this way of thought is constructive. It starts with one thing and then builds something else on top of it. And evidence is usually something that is, well, as far as I know, it's something that's measured, right? So if you don't measure it, you don't know anything. Measurements require a scale. So like a meter stick, or the meter at a gas pump that tells you how much you spent, or a standardized test, or even the Large Hadron Collider measuring the paths of particles so that their identity can be discerned based on their properties in different fields. These are all measuring devices, and the scales they use to make a measurement are based on assumptions. It's based on some certain worldview. So if you look at The customary system, it's quite a mess. Customary is the nicer word for it. The other word for it is imperial. It comes from, as far as I know, the British Empire. And you see all of these units, a crazy web of them. But at the end of the day, if that web isn't anchored to at least one of those units having a physical a metric, like a meter stick or an inch stick or who knows what, then all of it is meaningless. It's just a set of relationships, right? And it's the same thing for the International System of Units. There's actually the National Institute of Standards where physical kilograms are kept made of platinum in very, 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 very pure air so that they don't oxidize at all, or I don't even know, but they have it down to a few atoms at what the weight of the kilogram is. It's very strange. So it has to be anchored in something real, otherwise it's just relationships. And it's interesting to note that these relationships don't actually require the meter or the inch or the shaftment or the cubit to be anchored to anything at all. A cubit is a times 11 or divided by 11 or something, is a rod, a perch, or a pole. So as you can see, these relationships are free from assumptions. The assumptions are what ground the measurements. And there's a real danger in this sort of system, because if assumptions have a contradiction, you can derive anything, including all sorts of untrue things. This is called the principle of explosion in some schools of thought, and in reality, it's what caused, for example, the Mars Climate Orbiter disaster. So this basically was a Mars orbiter that was supposed to monitor the climate activity of the atmosphere, and NASA was using metric units, and one of their contractors used imperial or English units, and they didn't communicate about that, and because of that, the satellite crashed into the planet, and it was lost, hundreds of millions of dollars. So what they basically had assumed was that 1 gallon equals 1 liter, or something of the sort, which of course is untrue, and from that untruth, you get anything can be derived, including spacecraft saying it's fine when it's about to crash into the planet. So assumptions are very tricky things if you want to pick a set of assumptions carefully so that you don't cause a problem. In fact, it goes even deeper in a really tricky thing about math, philosophy, complexity theory, whatever you want, any of these rational systems. If you choose some axioms, which are basically assumptions that you're going to work with to derive things, and they have no inconsistencies, right? These axioms are, they're independent of each other, or they agree with each other wherever they overlap. There will be true statements that exist. No matter what axioms you pick that are consistent with each other, there will be true statements that exist that cannot be proven true, which is a kind of baffling. That means that there's no way to pick a good enough set of assumptions to prove all true things true. It's called the incompleteness theorem. It's one of the more trippy things about math. And even worse, if you want to pick a set of assumptions that allows you to prove anything true or false, it must have inconsistencies, which means you can prove anything true or false independent of its actual trueness or falseness, because you have to use inconsistencies. And to me, this feels a lot like the criminal justice system that we have in the United States, and also the debate clubs that people have in high school. You're handed a case, and it doesn't matter whether it's right or wrong. You are going to argue for a side and try to win. And this all comes down to the same stuff. It's the problem with the principle of explosion. Do you think that the United States laws are perfectly consistent? No, they're far too complicated, and there's far too many of them for it to be anywhere close to consistent. And so, of course, you can win any case if you have enough money. It's intrinsically an unfair system. Let's take a look at a rational system that's widely known in our society and varying degrees of controversial depending on what worldview you have. which is the IQ test. And I didn't make this graphic. It comes from Google Images, but it says that 70 is mental retardation and 140 is very superior, and it puts everyone on this hierarchy of how intelligent they are. And as you can see, it's also a hierarchy of wealth and of intelligence and of privilege, and someone going to college versus someone struggling. It's a hierarchy in every way, right? This measurement system it's called intelligence quotient, and it's supposed to compare your intelligence to the people around you. But again, it's a measurement. So what's the tiniest measurement that can be made? It's measuring a qubit, a single quantum bit of information. So like a single electron, finding out where it is, or what energy level it's in, something like this, something very, very tiny, right? And what we learn from looking at what a qubit measurement is a measurement is a projection onto an axis. So a qubit, it's like a multidimensional bit with some complex components. Yes, complex imaginary numbers are actually real. They exist in the real physical world. And you just, when you want to measure something, you can only measure it along one axis of this sphere that you see. I'm oversimplifying a lot, but basically you can measure it up, down, or left, right, or into and out of the page, or whatever direction you want, and you'll get either up or down as your answer. And based on what angle it was at before you measured it, it affects the probability of it being up or down, but not a guarantee. So you're sampling it, and you're getting an approximate estimate of what was there before, but you can never really know what was there before. Once you measure it, it actually destroys the previous state. So with the idea in mind that measurement is a projection onto an axis, this means it's math speech for flattening out many dimensions into a single one. And it's also probabilistic. If it's probabilistic at the smallest level, there's no reason to think it isn't also probabilistic at the largest level. If someone takes an IQ test every day, apart from them remembering how to take it, which is an example of destroying the previous state, their score might vary depending on what food they had earlier in the day and how their brain is functioning, how sleepy they are, etc. Right? And let's look at a random paper. I just searched for something and found this. Do you see that there's a paper here showing that apparently non-native and native peoples in whatever part of the world this paper was written in North America, perfect, okay, have different IQ scores, different distributions of IQ scores. And this is eerily reminiscent of the whole reason why the IQ test was created. It was basically created by some eugenicists who wanted to prove Nordic supremacy, right? So they Alfred Binet created this intelligence scale, which gave rise to intelligence testing, and it's based on what Nordic people believe, or people with somewhat derived from Nordic culture believe intelligence is. But if an entire ethnic group of people who function just fine in their community and in their land and in their language, it's very well developed in their traditions, they supposedly have a deviation or more of decrease in IQ. This might speak to the fact that the scale is measuring a type of cultural intelligence instead of intelligence. Intelligence is a word that needs to be defined with a scale, right? With a measurement. And maybe that scale isn't so universal. Certain people are very far along that scale, but other people are very far along other scales. And as proof of this, there's an ethnic group in Brazil, the Piraha, and what's fascinating about their language is they have no numbers or colors, they have no past and future tenses, they have only a present tense, and there's some evidence, some linguists even say that their language is one of the only, if not the only, non-recursive languages. And of course, Noam Chomsky, a famous linguist, is very against this, says it's impossible, all language is recursive. I'm not going to get into whether it's true or not because I don't know. That's a measurement and I'm not going to make it. But The point is they have a fascinatingly different way of speaking and also looking at the world without a past or future tense. And how is that possible? Well, everything they need to live exists only in the present. If they're hungry, they go get a fish from the river, or a fruit from a tree. And if they want something, they go talk to someone. And they live in small communities of a few hundred people. There's no need for any of that stuff. And they don't even have numbers either. And so I would argue that I suspect they would do quite poorly on an IQ test. And yet there is something profound about their language that reveals how deeply intelligent they really are. See, the children in their community, by the time they are 12 years old, it's been well documented, have knowledge of possibly up to 50,000 species of plants, animals, fungi in their environment. And not just knowledge of the names of them, but also how they operate, what they eat, when they sleep, how they move, whether they are good to eat or not for humans, how the entire food web, food cycle, life cycle even, around them operates, and what part they play in that complex ecosystem. And to me, that requires a profound level of intelligence that I certainly didn't grow up with. I don't know about anyone else listening to this recording, but I definitely feel that I don't have that type of intelligence. It's not easy to know 50,000 species and how they live without a fair bit of brain power. I would say that's my estimation. So, if they don't have rational intelligence, or maybe they do, but certainly not the same way, what type of intelligence are they using? And I don't know about the Piraha. I've never met someone who is Piraha, and I've never tried speaking with them, but I've done a little bit of reading about other indigenous groups from around the world, and a lot of the elders of these communities, for example, the Hopi, will talk about relational intelligence instead of rational intelligence. In fact, the Hopi consider it, or at least some interviews I have seen with elders, consider it offensive to call domination, hierarchy, and these types of things human nature, because they have never engaged in this in their 20,000-ish year history. The Hopi are descended, to my knowledge, from one of the earliest ethnic groups to cross the land bridge into the Americas, and in their history they have never attacked another group. This is an entire civilization that still exists today that has never engaged in domination of nature or another group of people. And just the existence of one proves that, it's not as universal as people might think it is. It might not be human nature. And let's not forget some of the incredible accomplishments of the Hopi civilization. They were the world's foremost dry farmers. They know how to farm in a desert. And my good friend from New Mexico told me that the beans that are dry farmed taste completely different from beans that are farmed using other methods, because the flavors are not washed out by the large amounts of water, and so the flavor is a lot more concentrated. They also have in their traditional knowledge lots of things that they do that used to be thought of as mystical nonsense, but modern science is finally coming around to realizing that they are right. For example, the Hopi always play drums at their harvests, and it makes the crops next year bigger. Sounds like magic? Well, no, it's just nature. The low-frequency vibrations have been found in papers to stimulate mycelium, which fixes more nitrogen for the following year's crop cycle to be bigger. And other studies showing even classical music makes plants grow, and these are used to be considered dark magic, but now are considered settled science. And meanwhile, for the last 20,000 years, the Hopi have been practicing these things. Well, maybe not 20, maybe 6,000, but you get the point. They've figured out a lot of things that used to be thought of as beyond science or anti-scientific. And going back to the idea of evidence, a similar word, evident, this definition of it that I found says plainly seen or perceived, manifest, or obvious. For something to be obvious, that should mean it follows very clearly from what is knowable or known, right? What follows from what is seen or what is measured, right? But also that word manifest there. Manifest is the same as evident. And this term manifest destiny, people today seem to use the word, at least the people I know, seem to use it in a different way than what it means or what it meant. It means the obvious destiny of American westward expansion, right? Obvious to who is my big question for you. Obvious, I think, to the European descendants who were creating this country of the United States. But in this painting, you see the Native Americans who are fleeing. I do not think that they thought of this as obviously good or obviously necessary or obviously anything. I don't think there's anything obvious about it to them other than the unawareness. In striking contrast with the obvious destiny, the manifest destiny of Anglo-America, the thing that is obvious to the Hopi is this rock carving that they have that apparently predates European arrival. It's called the Hopi prophecy, and it's quite a rabbit hole to go down, whether or not you believe that it comes from before Europeans arrived or not. That's up to you, but I personally find it fascinating because it details what will happen when the Europeans arrive and how there will be multiple chances to step off the escalating hierarchical ramp of being out of relationship with the earth. And there's multiple chances to get off, and there will be multiple earth-shaking events. And in the end, it's up to the people to decide if they want to change from their course. And I don't think that this Hopi prophecy is at all obvious to a lot of the people who manifested the United States, right? And just to clarify, the prophecy says that the consequence of not stepping off this escalating ramp, you can see that little squiggle looks a little bit like a stock market going up at the end. The consequence of not stepping off this ramp is destruction. It is the end of all things. And you don't have to believe it, but you can recognize that it's a different culture's obvious, a different culture's manifest, and that should be enough to get you thinking. So let's take a look at the alternative, or at least a alternative. It's this idea of relationality instead of rationality. We were talking earlier about the units of measurement, and there was that tangled web of the imperial units, and there's a similar one for the metric units for converting between them or relating them. And the funny thing about it is the relationships don't require really any assumptions. They just are what they are. But the assumption lies in which physical kilogram will you use as the kilogram, or which physical meter, or which amount of time that light travels in a vacuum, in which case you need which clock are you going to use, which atom vibrating at a certain temperature, at a certain frequency, a certain number of vibrations. That's 1 second, and then a light traveling is for that amount of time is a certain number of meters, etc. You get it. It all has to be grounded in an actual assumption. So if we remove the need for those assumptions and deal just with the relationships, we are left with what I'm calling relationality. Others have also called it that. Some people also call it intuitive thinking. I don't know. Sometimes that meaning will get lost on people, so I prefer the term relationality. And if we take a look, for example, at a hat, it's a perfectly commonplace object. It's in many cultures, people wear things on their head. And in English, I just said the word, it's a hat. In Lakota, it's a language from the northern part of the United States, from the people who were indigenous to that area, or at least the first people to arrive to that area. And their word for hat is, I'm sorry if I'm butchering the pronunciation, it's waposhtan. So waposhtan is, if you break it down, wa means indirect object, po means principal part, and shtan means wrap snugly around. So as you can see, that describes exactly what a hat does. It's not a word that you just learn and that's what it is. you say what the hat does. It wraps snugly around the principal part of something, and it doesn't even have to be a person. And so anything that behaves in that way will receive that same name. And so it kind of comes down to the idea of naming things for the verbs that they are, instead of the boundaries, the definitions, the boxes, the nouns that they are, right? So like glasses might be glassing instead of glasses, because it is what glasses do. They refract the light, right? Lensing or glassing, right? So some useful phrases for considering this idea are, there's two that I really like from Tiokasin Ghost Horse. He's a Lakota elder. And he talks of the thingification of everything. In English and a lot of the Indo-European languages in general, everything is thingified. Everything even suggests that all existence is things, right? Nothing is even a thing, right? Nothing itself is a thing, which is very strange. So, and this is kind of the nounification or the definition of everything into boxes around it, right? And as we've been over, people all disagree about the boxes based on what measuring sticks they're using. So you get lost in an endless cycle of disagreements over boundaries, and that becomes your life. The other one is subjective objectification. It's kind of funny. The subject and the object of the sentence are very common in a lot of Indo-European languages, with a subject, verb, object, or some other permutation. And this is usually a one-way flow of a verb. One subject does one verb to one object, or something similar, right? And this allows for hierarchy. It doesn't I don't know, maybe it's possible to talk with subjects and objects without it, but certainly if you have one-way flows, you can create chains and trees. If you have two-way flows, then of course you cannot. And in Lakota, there is no I, you, we. There are no pronouns, and the nouns are still kind of verbs. And so in reality, the verbs you just point a verb to the speaker, or you point a verb to the one being spoken to, or you point a verb to something other. Without ever saying a word for that, you just change the ending of a word, change the prefix or the suffix, and you end up with a directioned verb, a direction on the verb. And I think there's 260 directions for the verbs to point in Lakota. I might be mistaken about that. So another worldview that kind of has a similar idea is Buddhism. They talk about emptiness a lot. In reality, all things, I'm using the word thing here, but all forms, they say in Buddhism, all of these constructed, they're just ideas, and they will exist for some period of time, and eventually they will fall back into the sea of nothingness. And in reality, entropy always rises in physics, right? You can have localized violations of that, but if you look at the universe as a closed system, or some region of the universe that's closed, you'll see that entropy always increases. Even if you have some sort of entropic gradient that allows you to seem like you're violating that, if you zoom out a little farther, you'll see that you're not. And so everything will fall back into the sea of nothingness eventually. And so the only thing that is permanent is the emptiness. And even the atoms have a lot of space between them. And the atoms are many, many nines. 99 point, I think it's like 7 nines of just empty space, percent empty space. And even the particles themselves are just little smears. So things are a human construct. And I personally like to think about the difference between nothing versus no thing. So nothing is a thing. No thing means you de-thingify everything and see it in terms of only its relationships. So that's how I kind of think about this. So let's consider this analogy. Hierarchies is to extinction as cycles is to permaculture. What this kind of is getting at is something we can all see. If you farm in rows where you are the master of the land and you control it and you fertilize it and you herbicide it and you fungicide it and you pesticide it, you will get good crops for some years. But eventually the soil will be depleted, the crops won't grow anymore, you can try rotating all you want, but the nutrients just aren't there. And it's a great way to make money for a short period of time, but it's not sustainable. And on the flip side, if you try permaculture instead, which is based on the cycles of everything, it basically, you can build a food forest that will sustain itself, and its ecological succession will continue to have edible foods in it, with relatively low maintenance, and the soil will regenerate and the topsoil will become thicker and life will bloom and animals will move in, and pest control will take care of itself if you balance it right, if you have the right combination of plants and everything else in the ecosystem. And it's something that can endure. And hierarchical things in general will crumble. Every house of cards will eventually fall. I mean, so if we look at nature, it's all cycles. That water molecules, H2O, right? They get recycled constantly. The water cycle has many different branches through it, but in general, the water doesn't cease to exist. I guess some plants will split the water molecules, right? But eventually, the water molecules will be reformed further down the line. And so, if you want to implement this idea of cyclical nature and work with nature's cycles instead of trying to control it with a hierarchy, the food forest is a pretty easy template. You can have 7 layers of canopy, all edible plants if you want, or mostly. You can grow some stuff for the pollinators and for the animals as well. But it's just a formula that is just not considered enough because the big corporations can't pull it off. It's not really industrially feasible. It's really meant for and most feasible in a community setting. But not only that, it produces more calories, more nutrients per acre than any industrial farming ever can because it's polyculture. You're getting the different plants revitalizing the nutrients that each takes for each other. And you have different heights of plants that all are producing edible foods as well. There's a lot of wonderful research into this, but at the end of the day, it's just the way nature works. If you look at what happens when we try and break the water cycle, we end up with stuff like this. This is in California. Did you know that there are salmon native to all of the west coast of North America, and they can't get into their rivers to go upstream to reproduce because of the hierarchy, the dams that stop the water so that the humans can have it for watering their grass lawns. Their grass lawns that are supposed to be reminiscent of the rolling hills of England. And no, I'm not kidding about that. Grass lawns are not native to North America. They are a construct that came from England and Scotland. And to this day, people have monoculture grass lawns that are terrible for the environment instead of wildflowers. And because of that, the water consumption in California is super high, and the rivers are all dammed, and the salmon are going extinct. And people could have free food, but instead the rivers are food free. There's also the industrial farming in the region that uses immense amounts of water. But again, the reason why it uses so much water is because the soil is so thin. If we look at how ecological succession kind of works, if you start with bare rock, literally nothing, there's just rubble and rock and nothing there. If you can get some lichen to grow there and you don't disturb it, in hundreds of years, you will have a full-grown forest. The lichen will literally eat through the rock. The mosses will eat through the rock. You will get that starting to break down into highly nutrient-rich, lifeless dirt that will, over time, be colonized with microbiome. And over time, that will start to fix some nitrogen into the poor soil that the first little tiny plants will grow on, and those will add more nutrients, and as they decompose, the mushrooms will break them down, and it's a giant, wonderful chain. And as you can see this in this diagram, the soil gets deeper and thicker and deeper and thicker, and eventually you end up with a full-out forest. And this is just how it works. You can really regenerate an ecosystem. If you look in the Sahara Desert, it has been expanding. Desertification is real. It's really problematic. It's eating up the Sahel, the grasslands, right? And so there's been efforts to build the Great Green Wall of Africa, a giant green wall that will prevent the Sahara Desert from expanding right across the middle of the Sahel. And how are they turning the desertified Sahel back into lush areas? Well, they're putting little scallops into the land that trap rainwater, even if it's just a tiny little amount, for a little bit longer than it would have stayed as it flows downstream. And just that is enough to begin the ecological succession. And within 100 years, this entire belt, or maybe less, this entire belt will be completely lush. Not only that, but the activity of building these half moons, each one takes one person 1 day to make, and they've made tens of thousands of them. It's providing jobs for people, but it's also providing farmable land for the youth who otherwise would be moving to the big cities during the summer months, or maybe even permanently. And what it's doing is revitalizing entire communities that had lost their ability to grow food with the earth, and it's reconnecting them with each other and with the earth. So everybody wins. Let's look at some of the other consequences of hierarchically treating nature. Well, the bison covered North America from Alaska all the way to Mexico, completely covered in millions and millions of bison. And the Native Americans had a long and complex relationship with them, I'm sure. But the Europeans arrived, and the Native Americans were a pest, and they ate the bison. And so the U.S. Army gave people free rein to go kill all the bison. And they did this so that the Native Americans would starve. And if you don't believe me, you can look into it. But at some point it was for the money, and then after that, at some point they realized that every dead bison is a hungry Indian, I think, as I saw the quote somewhere. It's quite horrifying. Here's a photo of the pile of skulls of bison. I think this photo was from the 1870s. I'm not sure 100%, but that's, I think, what I saw. The bison were completely killed, down to just 300 left in 1880. And I think the Lakota were instrumental in siphoning them off to Canada, where they could save them. And then all of America got divided up with borders and railways and fences and everything else, and the bison's free-range lands disappeared. And settlers moved in, set up their monoculture farms, and this actually caused the Dust Bowl of the 1920s. It's when basically all of the topsoil blew away, because the bison had played a key role in maintaining the topsoil. The topsoil was 15 feet deep because of the bison, and it went down to 0 inches after the bison were removed. And what do the bison do exactly that's so significant? Well, they eat plants, they forage, they wander, they trample, and they keep moving. They don't really sit on one patch of land for very long, unlike conventionally farmed cows, which will eat the grass down to the ground. And when they eat the grass down to the ground, they fertilize it and grow it again and do it again, constantly extracting from the soil. But when the bison eat what they're foraging, they eat what they like, they trample the rest, and they keep moving in a giant herd, and they also poop everywhere. And their digestive process converts certain nutrients in certain ways that is not possible without a giant red meat animal. And so red meat is actually not bad for the environment. It's bad for the environment when conventionally farmed. Red meat is a instrumental part of a functioning Great Plains ecosystem. It actually is what allowed it to be so healthy and lush in the first place. So there's a documentary about this. You can look into it. It's called Carbon Cowboys. But it's not the only such way to approach this. It just happens to be one about red meat, because I know red meat is in the news a lot right now, getting a lot of hate for being a super polluting industry. It doesn't have to be. Adaptive multi-paddock grazing basically simulates bison activity and regenerates soil and brings back native plant biodiversity and everything else, all with a lower cost for the farmer and both more pounds of meat per acre and also more nutrients per pound. So all in all, rationality, philosophy, logic, reason, these types of thinking need to be deeply questioned, because I think they've led us down the wrong path far too many times, and I'm not convinced that they have any of the answers to the problems we face. In fact, I kind of think they're the source of it. So that's my own opinion as a young person wandering this world, but I hope anyone watching this all the way to the end will consider what ways relationships instead of hierarchies can play a role in your life, and what can you do to contribute to cycles instead of extraction. So thanks for hearing me out, and hope you have a good day changing the world.